Welcome back. This video will cover Part 2 of Chapter 5, Psychology and the Law for PSY 120, Careers in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Human Development. In Part 2, we'll be looking at bachelor's degree opportunities in this space. If you're interested in the intersection between psychology and law, the legal system, criminal justice system, there are lots of bachelor's level options for you to think about. That you can move into with your bachelor's degree. Some of these options you can move into without a bachelor's degree, in some cases a 2-year degree, in other cases a simple certification. So we'll look at a lot of these and talk about what kind of career opportunities are out there for individuals without an advanced degree. So the first one that comes to mind is the police officer. As you probably know, police officers, their primary job is to protect and serve. They protect lives and property, and I think we could all agree it can be a demanding and taxing career, and not one without controversy, and that can add to sort of the complications of considering this career path. Specific jobs in law enforcement vary in terms of what's expected, in terms of training in advance, and so on. Working as a police officer typically requires being accepted into a police academy, getting training, and then moving into the work and then climbing ranks depending on what one wants to do in that capacity. In large police departments, officers typically have a specific kind of duty that they are responsible for. So you have people who do traffic work. You have people who do work on the street, just doing patrols and so on. You have people who, as they get more experience, they may get to the rank of detective, where they're working solving crimes, finding offenders, tracking them down, and so on. So there are a lot of different types of police work to be done, and a lot of different assignments. In the past, so in the way back times, before your parents were born, people could become police officers, straight out of high school. Over the years, since, say, the 1970s, it's become more and more likely that there is an expectation that you'll have a bachelor's degree going into police work. Now, for like local police departments, smaller police departments, sheriff's departments, that's a little less likely. But if you're wanting to work in a federal agency, it's almost an absolute requirement that you have at least a bachelor's degree. Some police departments, especially large metropolitan police departments, there was a tendency toward really kind of demanding the bachelor's degree, but that's in flux right now because many departments are having difficulty recruiting individuals into police work. There is some variation from one police department to the next in terms of what their specific requirements are. Certainly individuals who are interested in psychology and criminology and pathology, as well as criminal justice and communications, all of those things are helpful in this career path. Certainly if you're a person who wants to do police work, getting a background in psychology, sociology, criminal justice, very, very helpful. Is psychology coursework required? Not necessarily. Correctional officers are individuals who work in corrections environments, so jails and prison facilities, whether they're publicly funded or privately funded. These are individuals who work one-on-one and in groups to keep inmates safe, to keep staff safe, And, that can be very challenging. It can be challenging work depending on the circumstances that people are in. Since correctional officers are working in that living environment where offenders are living, having an understanding of human social behavior and psychopathology can be useful. I have often heard it said that corrections officers, especially in prison settings where you have people who are spending sometimes years, sometimes decades of their lives in a correctional environment, the people who often know them the best are the correctional officers. They get to know these people who are living in their environment really pretty well, and that puts them in a really interesting and special kind of situation. An advantage of working as a correctional officer is, getting to provide stability and social connections to people who are often seen as less than fully human. So people who are convicted of crimes, people who are serving time, are often, people in the general public just want to forget that they exist. So there is some satisfaction of working in that space. At the same time, there is some satisfaction in being able to say, I work in an environment like this in order to protect the rest of society from people who are too dangerous to be in that world. Working in this environment, though, you need to recognize has many challenges. The median annual salary, according to your textbook, coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is not particularly high. Now, that's a median annual salary of about $50,000. That's not a very high salary. Salaries vary depending on the type of context. So, do some homework if you're interested in working in this space. There is high demand, and the demand projections, they're projected to decline. They were, as of 2022, they were projected to decline. But I have heard some discussion with the current situation in the United States that those numbers are actually going to go up. We'll all just have to wait and see who's right about that. Juvenile detention officers are individuals who work with the juvenile justice system to just supervise, primarily to provide contact and supervision of young people who have been accused of or adjudicated of having committed crimes. As an undergraduate, I did an internship in a juvenile court, and I was, my title, I really didn't think I deserved this title, was a intensive probation counselor. I was in no way a counselor. I was an undergraduate student doing an internship. But basically my job was to supervise young people, to make sure they were where they were supposed to be. Now, professional juvenile detention officers, sometimes they're called juvenile detention workers. They will work in facilities like juvenile detention centers where kids are awaiting trial, awaiting hearings, or they are incarcerated with other juveniles. So those juvenile detention officers perform the same role that corrections officers do, but they're doing so in facilities designed for kids. So, there will also be, other different kinds of services are going to be delivered in that environment. Many of the same problems and challenges that correctional officers have, juvenile detention officers will have as well. So part of your job as a detention officer is to maintain safety and security. But also, in that juvenile detention setting, they may be engaged in education and support, because kids who are in juvenile detention still have to pursue educational goals. Ultimately, the juvenile detention, the goal is to rehabilitate youth and get them back into society in a way that makes them less likely to reoffend. So juvenile detention officers are going to be engaged in that kind of work. Probation and parole officers, in this position, what you have are professionals who supervise people who have been released from correctional institutions. So a lot of times, so a person has gone to jail or they've gone to prison and they're granted parole. So they come out, they have a period of time where they have to successfully be supervised before they can be released, fully released from their correctional institution. Somebody has to determine whether or not they are maintaining the terms of their parole. So for instance, they may be prohibited from owning firearms. They may be prohibited from going to certain locations. They may be prohibited from interacting with other people who have records of criminal behaviors. They may have to submit to drug tests. They may have to submit to random searches of their living spaces and so on. So they may have to report to their parole officer multiple times a month or every 3 months, depending on their situation. Probation is where the person is not going to jail or to prison, but they're on probation. So the probation officer is going to, again, do that supervision, do the testing, make sure that the person who has broken the law is meeting the terms dictated by the court for their probation, or their probation can be revoked. So a lot of what these officers do is supervision. So they're going to be meeting with parolees, probationers in the community, assuring that they comply with the rules that they have been given, so that they can have either parole or probation. If they break those rules, there will be consequences for that. So probation and parole officers are engaged in enforcing the law. So sometimes what you'll see is people who migrate from being police officers to being probation parole officers. These are not typically people with formal mental health training, although I have heard from former classmates, but also some of my former students who have, for instance, gotten a master's in counseling and then went on to work in probation and parole. That's not the norm, but it can occur. Basically, the job is to assist probationers and parolees to, stay within the rules of their probation parole determinations, but also to help them get things that they need. Like I've said before, a very high percentage of people who have broken the law also have mental health issues and drug or alcohol issues. So a part of what probation parole officers do is help to connect people with resources so that they can increase the likelihood that people will not reoffend. The job does require that people have a certain degree of understanding of why people do what they do. So a background in social psychology, in abnormal psychology, in human growth and development can be really, really helpful. Forensic interviewing is, I would wager, something many of you have never heard of. Forensic interviewers are brought in, and again, large police departments, large metropolitan police departments probably have their own in-house forensic interviewers who do work for them. Smaller departments, they may have to pull people in who have specific training and certification in forensic interviewing. So these are people who typically work with victims, and more often with children and adolescents. And, you know, why did this become necessary? Why do we need to have training? Well, primarily because there were many situations in the past where police officers who didn't have really solid forensic interviewing training would ask questions in ways that were counter to trauma-informed practices. So they may be interviewing, say, a victim of sexual assault and asking them about what they were wearing, or asking them why they made the decisions that they made. All of that is very re-traumatizing for the person. Another thing that had been found was that, you know, police officers were being found to use leading questions, particularly with children and adolescents. And with kids, especially little kids, they tend to go where adults want them to go. So, like if a police officer asks, was it a big guy who hurt you? And they're providing the child with two essential pieces of information to follow there, big and guy. And they're already informing the child what they expect the child to say. And what developmental psychologists will tell you is kids want to make adults happy most of the time. So they will go with what that adult said. So the forensic examiner is specifically trained to work with victims of crime and to question them, to evaluate them, to elicit information in a way that is not going to be re-traumatizing, but is also going to be accurate. So there are two different goals there. Don't harm anyone any more than they've already been harmed, but also don't ask them questions in a way that's going to lead to spurious information, bad information that can't be used at a later point in time, or that will lead to the wrong suspects. Forensic interviews tend to be structured and designed to get at specific information without eliciting inaccurate information. So forensic interviewers who are good at their jobs are really good at interpersonal interactions. It's also helpful if they have a background in psychology. They may or may not have, say, a college background in psychology, but they have been trained specifically to do this kind of interviewing technique. Training and certification are not required in most locations, but it's becoming increasingly common to expect, especially in those large metropolitan police departments. It's becoming more and more expected that you have at least certification and training beyond the bachelor's degree, but it's not required of all positions. Court clerks are kind of like the person you may not think about very often, but they really keep the justice system working. It's an administrative job where you're really managing the way courts function in all aspects of the legal system, so civil as well as criminal courts. Somebody has to keep the court running smoothly, so they keep the docket for what cases are being seen or heard, who needs to be notified of what, and so on. So basically, court clerks need to be accurate, have a high attention to detail, because there's a lot of paper, a lot of documentation that needs to be monitored and kept track of. Most of these positions require a bachelor's degree in multiple different areas. I have seen people go into clerkship jobs with business degrees. I've seen them go in with psych degrees, social degrees, criminal justice degrees, a wide variety. There are training and certification programs that you can seek out that will make you more attractive as a candidate to be a court clerk, but they are not necessarily required. Now, what kind of preparation, if you're interested in any of these bachelor's level careers, what kind of psychology coursework could be an advantage for you? An obvious choice is abnormal psych or psychopathology. Also, if your school offers a forensic psychology course, taking that. Other kind of coursework, cognitive psych, interviewing or counseling, ethics, assessment, research and statistics, social psych, and substance abuse can all be really useful areas if you're looking at bachelor's level jobs in this area. Now, what kind of elective coursework could add to your resume? Studying communication, public health, community mental health, conflict resolution, criminal justice. Having a historical understanding, not just of the justice system, but also your region, your area, and the people in it can be really helpful. Social work, especially if you're talking those corrections areas and juvenile detention, social work background can be helpful. Sociology and writing as well. What kind of applied experiences can be useful? Anything that's related to mental health or criminal justice settings. I've had students who have done internship experiences at juvenile detention facilities in the region, at jails, both in Stark and Summit. I've had students who did internships in facilities where there have forensic wings, so like in major psychiatric hospitals or inpatient psychiatric units and so on. So there are a lot of different options there. I've also had students do internship experiences in legal settings, in law firms, public defenders' offices, as well as working in courts, in court settings. I had a student several years ago who worked in the Honor Court, which was a court specifically set up to deal with cases where you had veterans, people who served in the military, who had legal issues. So working in that court setting. I've also had students who have gone out and done work in substance abuse counseling, where they were doing internship experiences. So all of those can be really, really useful. What kind of research experiences, if you have interests in these areas? There's a lot of questions that you could ask in terms of personality variables. Correctional psychology spawns a lot of research questions. I have colleagues in sociology and criminal justice who do lots of really interesting corrections and rehabilitation work. Lots of research questions about violence and aggression, substance abuse, cognition, persuasion, compliance, and so on. And that concludes part 2 of chapter 5.